Hello, friend. Welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, let's get into the story. The train whistled its final cry as it pulled away from Alira's tiny, wind-bitten station, leaving a trail of steam that drifted like a ghost into the mist. Gregory Halden stepped down alone, his shoes meeting the stone platform with a soft but decisive thud, as though Alira herself had waited too long to hear his footsteps again. The air smelled of wet salt and turned soil, carrying with it the quiet hum of familiarity he hadn't expected. The hills around him rolled like green shoulders under a gray-wool sky, the sea in the distance murmuring secrets to the cliffs. He paused to take it all in. 28 years was a long time to be away from any place, but it was an eternity to be away from home. And Alira, that quiet, slow-breathing town by the water, was more than geography. It was the keeper of memory, a place where time didn't move forward so much as deepen. The people here still greeted mornings like they did 100 years ago, slowly, with thick bread and silence. Nothing had changed, but Gregory had. The boy who once dreamed with dirt under his nails and love in his chest had become a man who walked with custom-tailored suits and a wallet fat enough to silence most rooms. Yet now, standing on that empty platform, no one was asking him questions, and his money made no sound. Only the past whispered, threading through the mist and pulling at his coat like an old friend who still hadn't forgiven him. His ride to the estate was quiet, as most things in Alira were. The driver, a man with a beard white as sea foam, said little. Gregory didn't mind. The car ambled down winding roads that twisted like old tree roots, flanked by stone walls cloaked in ivy. Sheep dotted the hills like lazy thoughts, chewing slowly, uncaring of men and their tragedies. As the manor came into view, that towering house of gray stone and stubbornness, Gregory felt his throat tighten. It was as if the windows were staring at him with folded arms. The last time he saw it, he had been 19, yelling at his father on the front steps, suitcase in hand and fire in his voice. He hadn't looked back then, but now the house looked larger, lonelier. As they turned into the long drive, the past rose to meet him not as memories, but as weight in his shoulders, in his spine, in the very beat of his heart. He couldn't decide if he was here to reclaim something or to bury it. Either way, the house stood waiting, like a judge ready to reopen an old trial. The iron gates groaned as they opened, revealing the garden, overgrown, wild, and strangely beautiful in its neglect. Ivy coiled over the pillars. The air was heavy with the scent of old roses, and in that stillness, that odd quiet that only old places knew how to hold, something stirred. Not a sound, not a movement, just a presence. As if the walls knew who he was, and more importantly, who he'd failed to be. The staff stood in the entry hall when he arrived, lined up like chess pieces, their faces blurred in his periphery. He barely looked at them as the housekeeper introduced each one. His mind wandered, skimming old thoughts like pages from a forgotten diary. That was until his eyes fell on her. A girl, no, a young woman standing near the end of the line. Brown hair tucked beneath a modest scarf, eyes downcast but alert. She looked like someone born of quiet things. Wind at dusk, pages turning in an empty room, candlelight when the power goes out. Gregory didn't know her name yet, but something about her struck a chord he hadn't played in years. She didn't speak when introduced, merely nodded with a half smile, the kind that doesn't ask for anything and gives even less. The moment would have passed unmarked, just another name among many, until she turned slightly to retrieve a teacup from the tray nearby. That's when he saw it. The necklace. A fine silver chain, delicate as a spider's thread, with a single blue teardrop stone that caught the light like it remembered how to cry. His breath froze. That necklace didn't belong in this room. It didn't belong in this century. It belonged in the past, on a girl named Clara, beneath a willow tree, with promises made and never kept. He had given that necklace away nearly 3 decades ago, and the only person who ever wore it never spoke to him again. Yet here it was, hanging from the neck of a maid he'd never met, in the house he tried to forget. He said nothing. His lips didn't part. His body remained still, but his mind recoiled like a startled horse. Questions bolted in every direction, wild, breathless things with no names and no brakes. How did she get it? Was it a copy? A coincidence? But no, the design was too distinct. He remembered choosing it himself from a small jeweler in the city, months before his departure. Clara had loved blue, said it reminded her of the sea before storms. "It looks like it's holding its breath," she'd said, holding the stone to the sunlight. And so had he, every day since she vanished. Gregory clenched his fists behind his back, willing the thoughts to quiet, but memory had already begun its work. The girl with the necklace turned away, unaware of the storm she'd summoned. Gregory barely heard the rest of the introductions. He nodded where he was expected to, exchanged meaningless pleasantries, but inside, the foundation of his silence was cracking. The past, buried deep beneath ambition and time, had found its voice again, and it spoke not in words, but in silver and blue. The truth was circling him now, slow and inevitable, like vultures over a battlefield he hadn't known he was standing on. And the necklace, that tiny, shining thing, was its trumpet. Night in Illyria didn't fall. It crept in like a secret. The sky didn't grow dark in a hurry. Instead, it dimmed like the wick of an old lantern, one flicker at a time, as though heaven itself were reluctant to close its eyes. Gregory sat upright in the antique bed, watching the lace curtains shift in the breeze like pale ghosts passing through the room. There was no sleep, only silence, and even that was thick with memory. The air held the scent of pine and dried lavender, the same blend the housekeeper used when he was a boy. He had always found it calming once, but tonight it wrapped around him like a shroud. Each creak of the manor, the soft groan of the beams, the whispering tap of wind against the glass, felt as though the house were breathing around him. He had come back to sell, to wipe the slate clean, but the walls would not let him forget. They had seen too much. This was no homecoming. It was a reckoning. He reached for the glass of water on the nightstand and took a slow sip, but even that tasted old. Somewhere beneath the bed of sleep, Clara stirred in his mind, uninvited, unavoidable. He thought of her laugh, soft and sharp, like sunlight bouncing off broken glass. It used to echo in these rooms. Now it rang only in the hollow spaces of his memory, bouncing off walls long abandoned. And above all, the question remained, coiled tightly in the back of his throat. How had that girl, Mira, come to wear Clara's necklace? The next morning was wrapped in a hush that didn't lift with the fog. Gregory walked the estate grounds before breakfast, hoping to outpace his thoughts, but they moved with him, never quite trailing, always at his shoulder. The garden had grown wild in his absence. Ivy sprawled across statues like green veins, and the rose bushes bloomed in tangled rebellion. He paused by the fountain, long dry, where he and Clara once shared stolen afternoons and secret bread rolls from the kitchen. He could still hear her voice floating above the sound of water, speaking of dreams too delicate to name aloud. She used to believe in things like signs, feathers in doorways, birds singing at dusk, coins face up on the street. She'd say, "God speaks in echoes, Greg. You just have to listen for the quiet ones." At the time, he had smiled indulgently. Now he found himself doing exactly that, listening to the hush in search of what he had once dismissed. The image of Mira refused to loosen its grip. The necklace had glinted in the candlelight with uncanny precision, every detail too exact to be coincidence. He considered asking her directly, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the way she walked, unbothered, unsuspicious. She didn't wear the necklace like someone flaunting it. She wore it like it had always belonged. A keepsake. A birthright. Gregory lingered by the greenhouse before turning back, gravel crunching beneath his shoes like bones underfoot. A breeze picked up, and with it came the scent of morning dew and something else, old lilac, Clara's favorite. It felt like someone was watching, not from the windows, from time itself. He found himself studying Mira more deliberately, though always from a distance, careful not to let his gaze linger too long or his questions slip too easily. She moved through the manor with a rhythm he couldn't ignore, graceful, quiet, but not hesitant. There was confidence in her silence, as though she didn't need to speak to be understood. She listened more than she talked, and when she did speak, her words were soft-edged but certain, never reaching for more than necessary. It wasn't just the necklace. It was the way she stood by the window with her fingers resting lightly on the glass, the way she leaned ever so slightly to the left when she walked, just like Clara used to when her ankle ached in the cold. These weren't inherited habits. They were echoes, shadows in flesh. He began to ask subtle questions to the staff. "Where is she from?" he inquired casually, more than once. The answers never changed. "Here," they all said. "She's always been in Illyria." Her story was vague but stable, raised by an aunt after her mother passed. No known father. The aunt had died years ago. No one ever asked more. In towns like Illyria, stories didn't need to be complicated to be accepted, but Gregory felt every missing piece like a loose board underfoot. He started waking earlier, eating slower, just to increase the moments when she passed by. He wasn't sure what he was searching for, a word, a glance, a revelation, but what he felt was more than curiosity. It was a growing, inescapable sense of proximity, not just to Mira, to something buried beneath her. One evening, as dusk painted the walls in bruised lavender, Gregory wandered into the west wing, a part of the house untouched by renovation. The door creaked like it hadn't opened in years, and the smell hit him immediately. Dust, mothballs, and a trace of the perfume Clara used to wear, the one that clung to lace like memory. He didn't intend to go into her old room, but his feet carried him there before he had time to resist. The room had been untouched, the linen still draped in covers, the mirror veiled with a thin sheet like mourning fabric. He reached up slowly and peeled it away. His reflection met him, older, paler, lined with choices he could never undo. And then, in the corner of the vanity, he saw it, a jewelry box carved with vines, chipped at the corners. He opened it with trembling hands, expecting dust, but instead it was empty. Completely empty. The space where the necklace had once rested had long since been claimed. There was no note, no explanation, just absence, like someone had taken it before time did. A verse crept into his mind, one Clara used to scribble in the margins of her diary, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." He never understood it then. Now, staring at the hollow where the necklace once lay, he did. He had left her. But maybe, just maybe, not everything she gave him had stayed buried. It was on a late afternoon when the wind turned inward, not sharp, not cold, but pensive, that Gregory found himself drawn to the attic, though he wasn't sure why. The house had many rooms, but only the attic carried the weight of breathless memory. The door groaned against the hinges as he pushed it open, the sound like a tired sigh from a room long forgotten. Dust danced in shafts of pale light leaking through the small window. The floorboards beneath his feet whined in protest, warning him with every step that this was a place untouched by forgetfulness. Old trunks sat like sleeping beasts in the corners, draped in canvas cloths yellowed by time. One in particular caught his eye, smaller than the others, unmarked, but with brass latches that looked vaguely familiar. He knelt slowly, brushing his hand across the top as though greeting something sacred. When he flipped the latch, it clicked like the unlocking of an old secret. Inside, beneath layers of crumbling letters and brittle photographs, he found the envelope. Its edges were soft, corners curled, yet it bore his name in a handwriting that had once set his heart on fire. Clara. He sat back on his heels, staring at it, unable to open it right away. His fingers hesitated. The attic was quiet, but his pulse was loud, a drumbeat echoing the past. Finally, as if afraid the letter might crumble beneath his grip, he tore it open along the seam and unfolded the page. The scent hit him first, a faded trace of lavender and ink. And then the words that had waited in the dark for nearly 3 decades to be read. Her handwriting hadn't changed. It leaned slightly to the right, flowing with the same grace she carried in conversation. She hadn't written much, a single page, but her voice filled the space between the lines. He read slowly, not just with his eyes, but with his breath, as if her spirit were reading it with him. She wrote of love, not as a feeling, but as a decision. She wrote that leaving didn't scare her as much as being left behind. She said she understood ambition, but not abandonment. There was a confession in the second paragraph, subtle but painful. She spoke of something she feared would come between them, a part of her family's past she couldn't yet face. The words were vague, but the pain in them was clear. And then the closing lines, trembling in ink. If I never see you again, know that I loved you with everything I had. If you find this letter one day, I hope it means you remember it. Not just me, but who you were when you loved me. Gregory read it again, and then a third time, each reading peeling away a different layer of denial he had spent years wrapping around himself. He could feel her now, not just in memory, but in presence. Her spirit filled the attic like the scent of rain after a drought. He held the letter to his chest and closed his eyes, not to rest, but to reckon. There was no storm in the world that compared to the one rising now in his ribcage. All the years he spent believing time had made peace of their parting, he realized now time had merely made it quieter. But grief, like old paper, only grows more fragile with age. As night began its slow descent over Illyria, Gregory remained in the attic, seated on the floor beside the open trunk like a pilgrim in a ruined temple. He hadn't wept, not yet, but there was a weight behind his eyes that refused to lift. His mind wandered, not with regret alone, but with unasked questions. What had she meant by that unfinished thought about her family? What fear had taken root in her heart? Had it been shame? Illness? Danger? The letter had offered no answers, only echoes. And then, the thought that had haunted him since the moment he saw Mira. What if Clara hadn't left the necklace behind by accident? What if it had been passed on? The question crawled through him like a vine, coiling around his ribs. He thought of Myra's presence, her voice, the way she moved through the house as if her soul had lived in these walls before. Her eyes, not quite Clara's, but almost. The shape of her mouth, the sound of her laughter when she thought no one heard her from the garden. He had told himself these were coincidences. He had needed to. But now, the foundation of that denial cracked under the weight of this letter. A memory surfaced, faint, distant, of Clara placing his hand on her stomach the night before he left. "Do you ever think of the future?" she had asked, and he had laughed then, not unkindly, but carelessly. He hadn't asked what she meant. She had waited for him to ask. Now he wondered if that moment had been her final attempt. And he had missed it. Missed everything. The attic's dim light flickered once, briefly, and in that moment he swore the room inhaled. By the time he left the attic, the sky was a dark plum hue, and the manor below glowed with a warm light he did not yet feel. He descended the stairs slowly, one hand trailing along the banister, like a man feeling his way through an unfamiliar world. There were voices in the kitchen, laughter from the staff, pots clanging, the kind of domestic noise that might soothe an ordinary man. But Gregory felt like a traveler who had stepped through a portal and returned not to the place he left, but to a version that demanded something of him. He walked the halls without direction, drawn to the east wing, where Mira had been tidying earlier that day. He paused outside the library door, listening. She was humming inside, the melody low and soothing. It stopped him in his tracks. The song, it wasn't a popular one. It was Clara's lullaby. She used to hum it when they studied together, or when she was deep in thought. He hadn't heard it since he was 19. His throat tightened, and a terrible certainty began to form inside him. He knew, now, what needed to be done. Not just for answers, but for truth, for reckoning, for Clara. He would speak to the old housekeeper, Adeline. She had remained here through it all, the only person who had loved the house more than the Halden bloodline itself. She had been loyal, silent, discreet, and if anyone knew where Clara went, or who Clara left behind, it would be her. Gregory turned away from the door, the song still lingering behind him like a scent, and made his way down the corridor. His shadow stretched ahead of him, longer than it should have been, as if the past itself had risen and was walking with him. The moment lingered longer than the words did. They were seated in the library, where the scent of old leather-bound books mingled with dust and orange peel, a scent that reminded Gregory faintly of winter mornings from another lifetime. Mira sat across from him, a porcelain teacup resting delicately between her palms. The fire cracked softly beside them, throwing moving shadows against the spine-lined walls. Gregory had intended to speak about something else entirely, perhaps the renovations or the storm predicted for the weekend, but his eyes, without permission, were drawn again to the small pendant resting at the base of her throat. It sparkled with a blue that seemed to pulse with memory. He found himself staring longer than he meant to. She noticed. He quickly broke eye contact, cleared his throat, and attempted to cloak his inquiry in curiosity. "That necklace, it's rather distinctive," he said, his voice quieter than intended. Mira looked down at it as if she'd forgotten she was wearing it, her fingers tracing the smooth stone with care. "It belonged to my mother," she replied gently. "She passed when I was very small, so I never really knew her, but I've always worn it. It's one of the only things I have from her." Gregory nodded, forcing composure. "Do you know her name?" he asked. She smiled, that same soft half-smile that had unnerved him the first day. "I was told her name was Claire." "That's what my aunt always said." And there it was, the name, like a single drop of rain falling on a frozen lake. Claire. Close enough to Clara that it twisted something deep in him. Mira looked back down at her tea, unaware that her words had split the world in two. The library blurred for a moment, the warmth of the fire suddenly unable to reach him. Claire. Clara. Names could change. Names often did, especially in towns like Alira, where memories blurred like ink on old maps. But that necklace, there was no mistaking it. He remembered the day he bought it, the way it shimmered in the jeweler's hand. He had chosen it not for its price, but for its softness. A blue tear suspended in time, a promise in the shape of silence. And he remembered how Clara's eyes had widened when he gave it to her. She'd held it like a fragile bird, whispering something he didn't hear at the time. He had been too busy packing, too eager to leave, too young to understand that not every journey was forward. Now, decades later, the gift he thought lost had returned, not on Clara's neck, but on the daughter she may have died bringing into this world. He looked at Mira and saw traces of Clara in the slope of her cheek, the way her fingers curled when she was thinking. The realization settled on his shoulders like snowfall, soft, cold, inevitable. He had asked so many questions in his life. About money, expansion, strategy. But never the right ones. Not to Clara. Not until now. He sat across from her daughter, feeling as though he were staring into a mirror from the past, except this one reflected what could have been. She spoke again, her voice cutting through the fog in his head. "Is something wrong, sir?" Gregory hesitated before shaking his head. No, he lied, though the truth was blooming in him like an old wound rediscovered. Just reminded me of someone I knew a long time ago. Mira nodded thoughtfully. Funny how objects can do that. Sometimes I wear this, and it feels like I'm remembering something I've never lived. Gregory managed a strained smile, but inside his heart was beginning to move again. Slow, hesitant beats like a man returning from a long walk in the cold. Later that night, after the house had gone still and only the wind outside dared speak, Gregory stood at the window of his father's old study, watching the shadows slip along the fields. There was no moon, only the distant sound of the sea stirring. His hands rested on the windowsill, cold despite the fire still crackling behind him. He couldn't shake the conversation. Claire, a dead mother, a hidden past. He remembered stories whispered in the town square years ago, half-truths about Clara leaving under uncertain circumstances, her return quiet, unannounced. And now, as the pieces pressed against one another, they began to take shape. The letter, the necklace, the timing, the silence. It had always been there, waiting for him to stop running long enough to look. He needed answers, not assumptions. He thought of Adeline. She had been there, loyal as the furniture, discreet as the wallpaper. She had held Clara's hand during more than one tearful evening. If anyone knew the truth, it would be her. He slipped into his coat, the wool heavy against his shoulders, and walked the length of the corridor with a certainty that surprised him. The house didn't groan as he moved this time. It breathed differently, as if it too had been holding something back. When he arrived at Adeline's small cottage tucked behind the east greenhouse, her lamp was still glowing, a soft golden light that looked like mercy from the outside. He knocked twice. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow, tired, familiar. She opened the door wearing a knitted shawl and an expression that hadn't aged much since his boyhood. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, but not in surprise. "Come in," she said without asking why. He did, and as the door shut behind him, the past opened. The sitting room smelled of chamomile and dust, the furniture neat but worn in the way that comes only from years of gentle use. Adeline moved with the deliberate grace of someone who'd learned that every movement costs something when the body is older than its pride. She poured tea without a word, setting the cup in front of him with the same hands that had once tied his shoelaces when his mother was too tired. Gregory didn't drink. He stared at the steam curling from the rim like questions rising. Adeline took her seat slowly. "You've seen the girl," she said, not unkindly. "Yes," he replied. "She says her mother's name was Claire." Adeline's eyes closed for a brief moment, as if in prayer or apology. "She was Clara to you," she said. "But she asked me to call her Claire when she came back. Said it made it easier to forget the waiting." Gregory swallowed hard. "She was pregnant." The old woman nodded. "She returned with nothing but that necklace around her neck and a baby in her belly. She wouldn't tell me everything, only that she had written to you and you never came." His heart dropped. "I didn't read the letter." "Not until a few days ago." Adeline smiled, but it was sad and small. "Timing is a strange master, child." He looked at her, eyes pleading. "And the girl?" "She's yours, Gregory," she said simply. "Born in this house, raised in its silence, and never once told the truth." He let the words settle, let them echo inside his chest where something long dormant finally stirred, not grief, not yet, but a beginning. The fragile breath of something lost being found again. The ocean had always been near, but Gregory had never truly heard it until now. It wasn't the crash of waves that drew his attention that morning, but the way the tide sighed as it pulled back, a sound more weary than wild. He stood by the window, the same one his mother used to sit near with her sewing, staring not at the sea itself, but at the line where the water met the sky, a place no man could reach, but every man chased. There had been a time when he believed distance could dilute pain, that if you ran far enough, fast enough, eventually your guilt would become too tired to follow. But some truths were long-distance runners. They paced themselves. They waited. And now, 3 decades after he'd walked out of Alira with a suitcase full of ambition and a heart full of excuses, his past stood before him with Clara's eyes and his own blood. He hadn't spoken to Mira since the conversation with Adeline. Not a word. He had passed her once in the hallway and nodded, and she had smiled, the kind of smile that asked nothing and offered only politeness. But now he saw more. In every movement, in every gesture. The echo of a life he could have had, a daughter he could have loved, a woman he could have stayed for. He thought of the birthdays he missed, the illnesses, the first steps, the nights she might have cried and found no one but Adeline. And for the first time in many, many years, Gregory felt something unfamiliar, unfiltered remorse. The kind that doesn't whisper but hollows. That doesn't just ache, but bends the bones from the inside. He took the path behind the manor slowly, following the overgrown trail that led to the far hill. The grass had grown tall here, brushing against his legs like unspoken thoughts. As a boy, this had been his escape, a place of solitude, where he'd watch the gulls hover over the cliffs and swear he'd never become his father. Now, he climbed it not for escape, but for confrontation. At the top, beneath the gnarled branches of a weeping willow, stood a crooked headstone covered in lichen. The engraving had faded with rain and time, but he didn't need to read it. He knew whose name was etched there. Clara had been laid to rest here, far from the churchyard, per her request. Adeline told him she wanted to be buried where the wind could find her. He crouched down, knees protesting the movement, and placed his palm on the cold stone. "I read the letter," he said aloud, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "I read it too late." The wind stirred then, as if answering, not gently, but with a sharpness, as though it had waited too long for him to speak. "You carried it all by yourself, didn't you?" he continued, his throat tightening. "You gave me time, and I spent it like it would never run out." A pause followed, full of birdsong and regret. "I should have come back for you." His fingers traced the stone's edges. It was chipped at the corner, maybe from storms, maybe from years of no one visiting. And suddenly, the guilt wasn't abstract anymore. It was tactile, heavy, measurable. He had loved her once. And when the test of that love came, he had chosen escape. Now, years later, he had everything but the one thing she had wanted, his presence. And her daughter had grown up fatherless in the very house he had left behind. That night, Gregory sat at his father's desk, the mahogany surface worn smooth by decades of use and stubbornness. He ran his fingers over the old grooves in the wood, wondering how many times Clara had walked past this very room, pregnant and alone, while he lived in a penthouse suite in the city, shaking hands with men whose names he had long forgotten. The contrast was unbearable. He remembered nights when he had celebrated business deals with champagne, not knowing his child had been born miles away, wrapped in linen and silence. He thought of Myra's face again, not the face she wore when she worked, but the unguarded one he had seen once in the garden when she believed no one was watching. There had been something in her eyes, a thoughtfulness, a distance. He saw it now for what it was, inherited sorrow. Gregory poured himself a drink, though he barely touched it. The brandy burned his throat, but not enough to distract him. He opened the drawer beneath the desk and pulled out the old photo album his mother used to keep. He flipped past pages of stiff family portraits until he reached the one photo of him and Clara sitting beneath the willow. She was laughing. He was looking at her like she was something he'd just discovered and already feared losing. He stared at that image for a long time, until his vision blurred and the memory bled into the present. "I don't deserve her forgiveness," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear. Not Clara's, not Myra's. But still, the ache remained, the ache to be known, to be claimed not by success or sorrow, but by blood. He found her the next morning by the edge of the orchard, kneeling to pick fallen apples into a wicker basket. The morning mist still clung to the branches, and the air smelled of damp earth and quiet beginnings. She wore a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hair tied back with the same understated grace Clara had once carried. He approached without speaking, uncertain how to begin. She turned when she heard the crunch of gravel, offering him a polite nod. "You're up early," she said, not suspicious, just observant. "Couldn't sleep," he answered, voice tight. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "Too much on your mind?" He hesitated. Then, slowly, "Yes, far too much." There was a silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable, but expectant, like a stage before the curtain lifts. "Can we talk?" he asked. Mira tilted her head slightly, reading something in his face. She nodded. "All right." They walked together without speaking, their steps slow, uneven, like the rhythm of a song not yet learned. He guided her to a bench near the edge of the orchard, the same one Clara had often sat on to sketch wildflowers. He didn't sit right away. He stood, hands in pockets, unsure where to start. Then, with a quiet breath, he said, "I knew your mother." Mira blinked. "You did?" "Very well," he continued. "I loved her." She didn't speak, but her eyes didn't leave his. "She told me once she had written to someone who left." He nodded. "That was me." Myra's face remained unreadable. "And you're saying?" He nodded again, slower this time. "Yes, I'm your father." The words hung between them like a thread, invisible, trembling, real. The sky wore its quietest blue that afternoon, a shade not quite pale and not quite bold, a blue that seemed to know the weight of words yet to be spoken. Gregory had asked Mira to meet him beneath the willow tree, the same one Clara used to sit beneath, with a book on her lap and her dreams hidden in the pages. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It had taken him 3 days after the revelation, 3 long days of walking past her in hallways, of seeing her in the corners of rooms where Clara's laughter once echoed faintly. Those days were thick with silence, the kind that pressed on the chest like sleep paralysis. But now he waited on the wooden bench beneath the sprawling shade of the willow, the branches weeping gently in the summer breeze, like hands brushing the earth in reverence. He held no speech in his mind, no practiced words. What he carried was heavier than language. It was the ache of time, years gone, a childhood missed, a bond never begun but too sacred to ignore. He heard the crunch of leaves before he saw her. Mira arrived with quiet steps, her eyes wary but calm, a soft blue scarf wrapped around her neck as if shielding something fragile beneath it. She didn't sit immediately. She looked around first, at the bench, at the grass, then finally at the tree itself, her mother's tree, though she didn't yet know why it had always felt familiar. Then, at last, she looked at him, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with the quiet steadiness of someone bracing to receive a truth they'd already suspected but never dared name. When she sat down beside him, she did so slowly, like someone taking a seat in a memory. Gregory felt his heart clench, not in fear, but in reverence. There was a sacredness to this moment that could not be undone. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence settle first, let the sounds of the world fill in the gaps, the rustling leaves above them, the chirp of a bird somewhere in the hedges, the distant hush of sea wind curling through the orchard behind them. Then, gently, he spoke. "Your mother loved this place," he said. "She used to come here when she needed quiet, when she needed to think." Mira didn't answer, but he could see her breathing shift, see her eyes following the way the sunlight filtered through the willow's arms. "I used to sit here with her," he continued. "We talked about everything and nothing. She believed this tree listened." Mira smiled faintly at that. "Sounds like something I would believe." The words caught him, not just for what they meant, but for how she said them. The lilt of her voice, the shape of her phrasing, it was like hearing Clara again, but through a different wind. "I made a mistake," Gregory said after a moment. "A long time ago. I left, and she stayed, and I didn't know." He stopped himself, unsure if he had the right to complete that sentence. Mira turned toward him, her face unreadable but soft. "You didn't know about me." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question. It was a thread being gently tied between them. He nodded. "Not until recently. And even then, I tried to convince myself I was wrong. That it couldn't be." Myra's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "But you're sure now?" "Yes," he whispered. "I'm sure." The space between them was filled not with words, but with something more complicated, an emotion that wasn't yet love, not quite grief, but something deeply rooted and alive. Mira looked down at the necklace that hung against her chest and traced the teardrop stone with her fingertip. "She always told me it was special," she said, "that it carried something of her heart." Gregory swallowed hard. "It did. It was meant to be a promise. I gave it to her the night before I left. I never imagined it would become something more permanent than I was." Myra's fingers tightened around the pendant. "I always felt different when I wore it, like I belonged somewhere I couldn't name." Gregory closed his eyes. "You did, and you still do." They sat like that for a while, the silence no longer heavy, but necessary, a soft veil between past and present. The breeze stirred again, and a few strands of Myra's hair brushed across her cheek. She didn't tuck them behind her ear. She let them fall freely. "I don't know what this means yet," she said finally. "I don't know if I'm ready to call you father, or what to do with what I've just learned." Her honesty hit him like a breath of clean air. He nodded. "You don't have to call me anything. I just want to be near enough, if you ever decide you want me here." She turned her head then, and for the first time, he saw her not just as Clara's daughter or his unknown child, but as herself. Entire. Wounded, yes, but strong. Later, after she left to return to the manor, and he remained behind beneath the willow, Gregory stared up at the shifting canopy above him. The light dappled through in broken shards, creating fragments on the ground like stained glass in a chapel without walls. For the first time in years, he felt the ache inside him loosen its grip. Not vanish, but ease, just slightly, like a rope no longer pulled taut. He thought of Clara, of her laugh, of the way she used to sit with her knees drawn to her chest and ask impossible questions about love, about fate, about the cost of silence. He remembered once asking her if she believed in forgiveness, and she'd said, only the kind that doesn't come too late. Now he wondered if she'd been wrong, or if maybe she just never had the chance to see how time, like soil, can still nurture what's buried deep. His eyes drifted shut just briefly, and in that moment he imagined her standing across from him, young again, whole, watching them with a half-smile, proud of the girl she left behind and the man he was finally trying to become. When he opened his eyes again, the branches were still swaying and the wind still carried her name, but softer now, as though it, too, had begun to let go. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his trousers, and turned back toward the manor. The house waited in the distance, unchanged, but something in him had shifted. Something fragile and necessary had begun. Not a return to what was lost, but a turning toward what could still be found. If this story has whispered to your spirit, let it be more than entertainment. Let it speak to the parts of you that still wait for closure, for healing, for truth. Sometimes the people we walk away from are the ones we were meant to walk toward. And sometimes silence speaks louder than the words we were too afraid to say. Don't wait for time to give you permission to do what love is already urging you to do. If there is someone you need to forgive, do it. If there is someone you need to speak to, go. If there is something in your past that's still bleeding into your future, face it. Let the weight fall off. There is no healing in pretending, but there is deep freedom in confronting the truth with a willing heart. Just like Gregory, maybe you've missed some moments. Maybe you've let the right person become a memory. Or maybe someone out there is holding on to a piece of you and waiting for your return. It is not too late. Restoration is still possible, not because time can be undone, but because grace makes room for what time has lost. To the soul listening right now, the one carrying years of silence, shame, or regret, I ask that you reach them gently, just like you reached Gregory beneath the willow tree. Unfold the parts of their heart that have been closed by time and hardened by pain. Soften the soil of their spirit, Lord, that they may receive peace again. For the one who walked away when they should have stayed, may they find the strength to return, and may mercy meet them when they do. For the one who was left without answers, may your comfort become their clarity, and your presence become their peace. God, heal the relationships that were buried too soon. Resurrect the conversations that were never finished. Restore what years have tried to erase. And let every lost connection that still holds purpose be revived in your perfect time. Remind us that no mistake is too old for your mercy. No silence is too deep for your voice. No heart is too broken for your hand to mend. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.